You're listening to China Manufacturing Decoded from the Sofeast Group. Hello, it's January 2026. This is episode 310 of the podcast. Adrian hosting. Paul Adams joins me. Hello, Paul.
Hello, Adrian. How are you doing, sir?
I'm well. How are you doing in this new year?
Very well, very well. It's turned a bit chilly over here in sort of Dongguan, but I can't complain.
Yeah, I mean, chilly by South China standards. Paul, you joined me today. You're leading our new product development team. Largely, you're at Agilian Technology, and we are talking about new product development, right? So we're talking about going from idea to mass production and why your NPD partner really matters, right? So often, if you're going to be partnering with a contract manufacturer like us, for example, or others, that has a dedicated NPD team, this is critical for product success. And you're going to talk us through why that is, right? Because basically, one of your and your team's key role for us is guiding customers through that whole very, very complicated NPI, new products introduction journey, which we've spoken about before. There's millions of things that can be done and a lot of things that definitely should be done. So it is quite complex, right? So this is what we're talking about today, why your NPD partner matters. So first, Paul, let's talk about the NPD process and why this is something that matters and we should focus on.
Yes, well, I'm not going to focus too much because, as you rightly said, Adrian, we've covered this multiple times, and I dare say we'll cover it a few more times during 2026 as we move forward. So this is going to be a very holistic view, a quick broad brush of what that process is. But the NPD team, new product development team, looks after a product that goes through the NPI process. Okay, so it's more of a journey as opposed to a single point in time, snapshot. So the process is broken down into different phases. So no surprise here. But we've broken it down where we are into 6 phases, and they are feasibility, where we sort of basically we take the customers or take your idea or specifications or a rough outline, and we look at that with respect to how feasible is it in order to go from where you are into something that's tangible. In other words, is it possible? Okay, so that's the first stage. If we determine it is possible, then obviously the next stage is to create a proof of concept or a prototype. Now, during the prototype stage, we would expect to run through multiple iterations. The first one being a basic knock-up of does it work? What's it going to look like into something that is fully functional, not necessarily with mass production materials. It could be, but not always. But the key thing is to make sure everything works and functions as per your or the customer's specification requirements. Okay. So then we move into the tooling. And basically, this is where the rubber meets the road. From a tooling point of view, we're turning the prototype into something that is more like a pre-production. In other words, we're validating the engineering stage. Okay, so we've looked at the prototype, we've worked out, yes, everything's functional, everything's good. Now, let's put some meat on the bones and spend some money on some tooling. So once we've done the engineering validation, we need to get those parts from the tooling, and then obviously we need to validate those tools. So therefore it's the tooling validation stage. Okay, I'm going through these quick, but obviously, it takes a bit of time to go through each of these stages. But
That's fine.
But the important thing here is that we are now preparing for mass production. Now, it's a dangerous thing to skip any process. I think this is where the NPD team comes in, because we can guide you very, very carefully and closely, work very closely with you through this whole process. But before you go to mass production, you must go into the pre-production phase. Okay. Now, I had just today had a customer respond to an email that I sent out where we highlighted the results from our pre-production run number 1. And we picked up a number of different issues that absolutely could not move forward into mass production. If it did, you'd have sort of 30% failure rate, which is disastrous when it comes to mass production. So we discussed everything, and we approved on going into corrective actions on a number of different elements before we go into the next pre-production, which will be sort of pre-production number 2. And that will not be signed off until we hit certain criteria. But once that criteria is met, away we go. We're into mass production, and everything's looking hunky-dory, as it were. So that's the process, the MPI process. Like I said, holistic view, very broad brush, very quickly run through that. But it's important to understand the role of the MPD, which we'll get into in a minute. But I just want to stress that a lot of ideas fail, okay? And this is, I don't know what the percentage, you call it 80%, and this is a big number, okay? And I'm pinning that number down because it's a big number, okay? Because it's not a bad idea, because it's poorly executed, okay? Maybe, okay, with an unclear scope, and you always had scope creep, or later on during the production or during the process, right, you're skipping some of those phases because you need to get to production really, really quickly. Therefore, you're going to miss the pre-production, and therefore you do get a horrendous yield, and therefore the product fails. So with the MPD team guiding you, there's a lot better chance or higher probability of a successful product. And this is what we're all about. That was a very quick, broad brush of what the MPI process does, and quickly touch on what the MPD team does.
No, that's good. That's good. And I like the analogy of the journey, right? Because so hard to sort of call it a service, isn't it? It's not like one individual thing. It's an entire journey. So yeah, I like that.
It is a journey, and we pride ourselves with respect to working very closely with sort of customers and building up a relationship. Now, with that relationship comes trust. You can't move forward and you can't build a successful product or launch a product or an idea without a trustworthy partnership. And this works both ways. Okay. And this is where I want to get into what the role of the MPD team is within a contract manufacturing company. Okay.
Okay.
So, and I'll take it as firsthand. So it's not necessarily all about our company, but this is, it could be any contract manufacturer. Okay. But
Sure.
these points are really, really important. It is key that your MPD lead or team member becomes the voice of two people or two entities. First of all, okay, I'm gonna say in the first term because I am the head of the MPD team. So I would become and need to become the voice of the company. Clearly, I'm representing the company, and we are providing a service which you just mentioned. Okay, but it's a lot more than that. Okay, so we have to represent the company and make sure that we're doing the best on behalf of the company. Okay. In other words, we're following the process and we're doing the best we can throughout the process, and every team member, R&D, prototyping, tooling, etc., etc. But on the flip side, I always have to put myself in the shoes of the customer. Okay. So I am looking out, but I'm also looking in, because the customer, this is where the relationship and the trust has to be built. Okay. Because I have to earn, or the MPD team member has to earn that trust and build up a relationship with the customer so that we are representing the customer and we are the customer's voice to the company. Because the customer cannot be at the company all the time. Right? If they are, well, yeah, they're probably spending too much time in China. But in general, that is not the case. Okay, so therefore, they are looking for the MPD team member to represent them, right, and say, okay, the customer wants this. The customer has to have this. This is not negotiable, or we can negotiate on this. And that, and it's we're bridging that gap. Okay. So another aspect, when we got that sort of it's a high responsibility position to hold, you have to, looking from the company to the customer, we need to provide technical solutions for issues that come up with a problem on their product.
Mm,
Okay.
mm,
So it's not just about taking orders. It's not just about saying, yeah, we've got another contract and I should just put you through the MPI process and blah, 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 and sit back and enjoy the ride. No, it's a lot more involved than that, Adrian, as you can imagine. Yeah. And
mm,
it's our responsibility in order to get the best we can from both the organization, in other words, the company, and the customer's point of view, that we should be offering the best technical solutions to the problems that the customer may face or the issues with the problem itself, the product itself. Secondly, and this is where this is definitely where we're sitting on the fence, we need to manage the scope and the budget of the project. Okay. From a scope point of view, we need to make it very, very clear what that scope is for the product with the customer. We need to lock that down. We then need to represent the customer with R&D, for example, where R&D say, well, yeah, wouldn't it be better if we had a bigger switch or a smaller switch or a faster motor or a slower motor or a louder motor, whatever the case may be. So no, we can't do that because the specification says this. In other words, it's in the scope. We cannot move outside the scope. Otherwise, it's scope creep. Yeah, and we get all sorts of
mm,
problems. Yeah, and we talked about this previously. You know, are you going to change the quality? If you're going to change the quality, what else moves? Does the cost go up? Does the cost go down? What about the quality? And what about the time in order to implement something? So that's on a previous or a different sort of podcast. But it's important that we manage that scope. And from a budget point of view, we are working with both the company. In other words, we've provided a quote for the work to execute each of the phases. Okay. Very rarely do we go, all right, Mr. Customer, so you're at the feasibility stage. And by the time you get to mass production, there's $500,000 or 10,000, whatever the case may be, and we'll stick to it. Virtually impossible to do that. So we
mm,
break it down into phases, but we are providing a budget or a quote, okay, that has been calculated. We then got to manage that quote or that budget or allocated time, let's say, for the work in order to execute and sort of provide the results for each of those phases. If there's scope creep, if there's quality issues, we internally, in other words, the company, may have to adjust or add additional hours, or, if it is a scope creep because of the technical issues causing the requirement to have a more expensive sort of solution, we then have to represent the company and go back to the customer and negotiate with the customer. So this is really key for the MPD role. Okay. And
mm,
again, we need to build up that trust and that relationship with a customer in order for them to say, oh, I trust what you're saying. And I understand that, it's going to take a little bit longer. I don't necessarily like it, but I understand because I trust what you're telling me, and I trust you as a partner. And I think that's a key word. Okay. Another thing that is absolutely paramount, and I drill this into my team all of the time, your MPD team must operate with transparency.
mm,
Okay. There's the old adage that, and I've experienced this many, many times, and quite a few years back, I must admit, but many, many times. Unfortunately, when it comes to some Chinese contract manufacturers or suppliers, they will tell you what they think you want to hear, as
yes.
opposed to what the truth is. All right. This is not the way to work. Okay. And I drill this into my team all of the time. Transparency is key. Okay. If you've got an issue, raise that issue before there's an issue. In other words, you have to preempt some of these issues that come up and be transparent about it. Talk to the customer. Okay. Oh, by the way, Mr. Customer, I think we're going to have a problem with this particular part because it's end of life on one of these components on the PCB that was specified. Therefore, we're
Mm,
going to need to change it. But whenever, maybe you should do it now, or if you want to build that next 1,000 and then give you time to do whatever. But we've got an issue. The key thing is
mm,
you need to raise these issues. In other words, you have to be transparent throughout the entire process. Okay. So basically, that's the key roles of the MPD team. Provide technical solutions where possible, look after the scope and the budget, okay, and work on a transparency basis. Absolutely key in order to build trust and relationship to move forward to provide a successful outcome of the product. Okay.
mm,
This is not
yes.
just about, I'm going to provide you a prototype and I don't care. It has to be a win-win situation.
Yeah. Yeah. So as an importer, when you're sourcing and when you're assessing your potential contract manufacturer, these are definitely some touchstones that we can turn to and consider and bear in mind. So yeah, I think that's helpful and good to kind of get under the hood of what the MPD team it should represent and be doing. So that's good. Next section, right? So how MPD should embed risk mitigation in every phase.
Well, I just talked about transparency, and this is a good point,
Hmm.
to Adrian. Risk mitigation. Okay. I didn't touch on that previously because I knew we were going to come up on this one next.
Yep.
So I banged on about transparency and absolutely critical for, trust and making sure that we can actually provide the outcome that everybody is a win-win situation. Now, part of that is identifying risks and how we manage that
Mm,
throughout each of the phases. Now, clearly, there's risks throughout the entire development process and even in beyond mass production. Okay, that's no surprise to anybody. But as we go through that, I'm just going to quickly touch on some of the phases and how we approach it. Let's say,
yep.
we'll start with we use a phase gate. In other words, there's a core team that reviews each of the end of phase and can we go into the next phase? And again, we've touched on this in a previous sort of podcast, Adrian, I know.
Mm,
But it's a case of like looking back. In other words, did we achieve everything? Okay. Where we are at the moment, is everything okay? Okay. From a technical point of view, from a budget point of view, from a resource point of view, and can we move forward? What are the risks? Now, this is where we look at the risks moving forward and that transparency with the customer.
mm,
Respect to, by the way, Mr. Customer, we're okay, but what about you? And this is where the MPD needs to represent the company to make sure that the customer is happy to move into the next phase. Now, at the early stages where we're talking about feasibility, there's little risk with respect to moving forward from a marketing validation point of view, let's say. Okay. But that's one of the questions that we ask, because if
mm,
the customer says, oh, I've got the next best thing since sliced bread. What is it? It is sliced bread. Well, guess what? They make saturated market. Have you thought about that? Well, no, really, I haven't. No, I thought I was the only one. So it's you got to ask the right questions at the right time. Okay, and part of that is understanding what the risks are, not just technical risks, right, but other risks associated with that. As we're moving through the MPI process, the deeper you get into the risk analysis. Okay. And it's important you run a risk analysis. And this is a living document. It's not just one time bang everything down on a spreadsheet and forget about it.
no.
It has to be a living document because there will be different risks come up at different phases. Put a mitigation plan in, you'll implement the corrective action and you'll tick that off and everything's okay. But something else will raise its head. Okay. And in particular, during the design development and the prototyping stage. Okay. This is where a lot of risks come up that not necessarily identified at the earlier stages. Okay. And this is where we
Mm,
work with a cross-functional team where I will get my mechanical guys together. I'll get the electronic guys together. Potentially, I'll get the quality guys together. I'll get the production project managers together. And so it's basically a core team. We get the MPI team together. And this is the core team we're basically talking about. And we should go through that and say, okay, I have generated, or the NPD would have generated the initial risk analysis. We'll share that. We'll go through that and say, okay, has everybody agreed? But what about anything else? Has anybody else got anything to put into this risk analysis? And there's for sure something that I would not think of, but maybe one of the quality guys would have done. Okay. We would then, part of the core team, this is where we're going back to the customer, say, oh, Mr. Customer, this is our risk analysis. Is there anything that you would like to add in? So it's really all encompassing
mhm,
from a risk analysis point of view. And each of these phases, well, I went through the 6 phases earlier. At each of these phases, like I just mentioned earlier, we will have that core team review in order for us to say, yes, we are happy to sign off on this current phase and move into the next phase. And we always work with the customer as well in order to get their buy in. Are you, Mr. Customer or Mrs. Customer, happy to move into the
mm,
next phase? And in some cases, they're not, but we are, if you know what I mean. So from a company point of view, we have provided everything that meets the requirement of that particular phase. But a customer may have other constraints that are not allowing them to move forward. Okay. Budget being one of them, personal issues being another, company buyout being another, et cetera, et cetera.
yep,
So you see all of these different risks with respect to the project is not just about the technical aspects itself. Okay. So that's basically where we are coming from, sort of a risk point of view, without going on too much. But it is one, a living document. Two, it is not just an internal document. We share this with the customer. It's a
mm,
total core team, and it's a cross-functional team that works on this. So,
mm.
and it goes all the way through the right up until mass production. In other words, pre-production, all of the validation stages, and into pre-production, and thereon after. That
Mm.
makes sense.
It does. It does. A lot to remember, but definitely good stuff to bear in mind. And yeah, you're sort of tying this to the phases that we work to. That's definitely something that's important to add into the show notes. So we've got a page on our website which will explain these key phases as we go through that MPI journey with you, and you can tie it back to what Paul's speaking about now. So as we come towards the end here, right, let's just talk about some of the benefits that customers are going to gain, or importers that might work with us, or other contract manufacturers with a strong MPD team.
Emphasis on the strong MPD. Okay.
Oh, yeah,
But well, otherwise it doesn't work, Adrian. You know, so
sure.
it's, as I say, they're just order takers. Yeah, we've got another project in. Excellent, fantastic. Let's move, as opposed to being proactive and working with the customer. So,
Yes.
and that's the key point, I think. Working with
And and we've spoken many times about the risks there as well. I mean, look at the amount of customers that we end up with who've actually worked with a manufacturer before they've come to us, and things haven't gone right for whatever for a multitude of reasons, right?
it.
And that's exactly what we're not talking about here.
Yeah, true. Yeah, one of the benefits of obviously working with sort of a highly tuned, strong MBD team is and a contract manufacturer that has an MPI process in place, that potentially you get faster time to market. Okay, because it's a fine-tuned process, because the MPD team know exactly what they're doing. They can work with customers. They can work as the customer's voice, as well as making sure that all of your information as a customer gets translated into meaningful actions within the company. Okay. But just as importantly, we can then translate what we're doing When I say it's not literally a translate, but basically we're taking the information internally and then working closely with the customer and letting them know on a very, very frequent basis exactly what's going on because of that transparency. And because everybody knows exactly what's going on at every single point in time, we tend to move to market pretty quick or
Mm,
faster as opposed to a non-organized or not as strong MBD team. So for sure, definitely.
mm,
What else could I think of? Well, as another one is we're introducing, okay, quality and reliability from the outset, simply because of what I just said. We know exactly what we're doing, okay, because it's not our first rodeo. In other words, we've got an MPI process in place. I keep going on about this. And we
mm,
have strong MPD team members, okay, that do work with building up a relationship, i.e., the trust and that transparency, that are capable of managing scope, budget, and working with transparency. And because of that, and all of the processes we have in place, that inherently builds in quality and reliability as we move forward. Okay.
mm.
So we automatically, we don't even think about it. There's a DFM for the tooling. There's a DFM for, manufacturing, design for quality, design for cost, design for assembly, disassembly. All of these things, they're on our checklists already. We haven't even got to think about it. We just do it. So therefore,
And
we
and
inherently build that in.
and these are the kinds of things that a poor fit manufacturer might not be doing as standard. And that kind of ties in a little bit, Paul, with what me and Renaud were speaking about last week, because we were talking about what happens if you end up working with a manufacturer who's not the right fit, right? And missing important things like doing DFMs at the right time are absolutely a feature of that. So, yes, this is something to keep in mind for sure.
It is, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I will talk about us now. Okay, I can't speak for everybody else or any
No.
other contract manufacturers, but this next point is definitely something that we pride ourselves on as an organization, as a company, and that is IP. In other words, intellectual property rights. Okay,
Mm,
and we at our organization, at Agilian and Sofeast, right, we take this very, very seriously, right? And we gain the trust of the customer because this is one of the key attributes of the company. This is, you cut one of us in half and it's like protect everybody's IP. You know?
yeah,
So
yeah,
like
definitely.
a stick of rock,
Hmm.
But it's true, and it has to be a win-win situation. If this goes, there goes your trust. Goes to trust, ah, forget the project moving forward. You just can't. So you've got peace of mind. Okay. And I think this is a key thing here because, yeah, sometimes, unfortunately, we still get these horror stories about some contract manufacturers in China do this, and this, and whatever the case may be. I'm not going to go into it.
Mm,
However, with a peace of mind working with us, you can actually go to sleep knowing that your very, very special, idea or product with your intellectual property right is safe
mm,
because we're looking
mm.
after it. Okay.
Yeah, that's critical.
That's a
And
key thing.
it's not only China, to be fair, as I know you will 100% agree. I mean, it can be when you're manufacturing
True.
abroad, right, and you're an importer and you've got a product idea that you're trying to bring from, just a design to market. Of course, one of our common concerns from people that we speak to is, well, I'm really worried about my IP, and you're right to be worried, of course, but this can happen anywhere. So yeah, that you've got to assess who you're working with and get a good handle on how well they're going to protect that IP and what sort of rights you've got over your IP, just in case something feels off. Then maybe that's a red flag.
True. Yes, that's right. Yeah, and sometimes working with, let's say, cheaper contract manufacturers where you think you're getting a bargain.
Mm,
Um, maybe
yeah,
not.
yeah. Where are the strings? What strings are attached to that?
Yes, that's right. Something comes to my mind. Sort of the cheapest quotes are often becoming more expensive, you know,
Mm,
through the mistakes made. because they're not
Yeah,
organized. So
absolutely.
expertise has a value. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
Uh,
Okay. Well, that's a good view into what an NPD team does in a good case, right? So this is what we're looking for as an importer when we're sourcing, and and what you do on the ground every day, and what your team's doing. So I think the right person to kind of pull back the curtain on that. So I quite liked you mentioned order takers, right? This is the opposite of a factory that's an order taker and is just like, okay, there's your products, right? We're going to bang some out. This is a partner it's not just building a product, right? So they're protecting what your vision, budget, timeline. This is huge.
it is, and it's one of the things that so we try to look at as the more technically demanding projects come through the door, we'll need an MPD team. And it's not our objective just to provide one single solution. We're looking for
Mm.
an ongoing relationship where we can actually work with the customer to build their portfolio over many years.
Yeah. And for me, I periodically come into Agilian throughout the year. And actually, it's amazing to me how often I bump into our customers there. They don't know I'm coming, and I don't know they're there. So people really are coming back year after year and working on site with us even, which is really cool to see.
It is, yeah, that's a really nice sort of reassurance and affirmation that we're doing a good job because they're coming back time and time again.
Yep, absolutely. Great. Well, thank you, Paul.
Okay, Adrian, that was good.
If you like what you've heard today, and you want to learn more about how we're helping people with new product development, of course, visit our website for Agilian. The link will be in the show notes. And you can even contact Paul if you've got a product that you need to discuss. And I'm sure he and his team can give you some feedback and give you some help.
Absolutely. No problems. Just reach out.
Great. Back next week as normal, everybody. Thanks again for listening to this podcast brought to you by the Sofeast Group. We're on a mission to provide you with everything you need to manufacture effectively in Asia, including inspections, auditing, new product development support, contract manufacturing, 3PL warehousing and fulfillment, and much, much more across Asia's key manufacturing areas. Visit us at sofeast.com, that's SOFEAST.com, to learn more and get help. If you've enjoyed the podcast today, please do rate, review and share because it will really help others discover us too.